Chapter 16. Sunday late afternoon. Jeremiah's face shifted as myriad emotions whispered across so fast it was almost hard to identify. Doreen still caught sadness and grief, anger and frustration, and then acceptance. Maybe I do know of a cold case then. He sagged into the chair on the other side of the counter, his face sagging a bit too. Is that all you came for, or did you come to buy something? He motioned around the store. Take a good look, he said. I need to make a sale today. Her heart lurched at that. Is business that bad? He shrugged. Well, it sure ain't good. As luck would have it, she spied a couple mugs right in the front of the store. They were a matching set, nice for coffee, with a handmade pottery look to them. She picked them up and admired them. How much for these? He looked over and said, 50 cents. She beamed and said, I'll take all 4. Then she picked up the 4 and put them on the counter. But now she was hooked and she looked around, wanting to take some time and see if she needed anything else. Not that she needed much, but still. What can you tell me about Manny? She asked, her voice pitched ever so slightly higher so she could continue to look around. Vases and all kinds of stuff were here. She didn't think she had a vase at home. She couldn't remember. Mac had helped her go through her entire kitchen stock, weeding it out to something much more manageable. There might have been a vase, but she didn't remember, and didn't want to buy one if she had one. She wandered through until she found a lovely serving bowl that would do for one of her salads. Thaddeus chirruped at her shoulders. She picked up the bowl, studied it carefully, checked it for chips, and contemplated its size. Thaddeus's head bobbed up and down as he looked at it beside her. Jeremiah called out, That one's $1. And she grinned to herself, thinking what a steal that was. What a great shop. She was really getting into this. She took the glass bowl and placed it with the cups. You didn't answer the question. He looked at the items on the counter and said, A big spender, aren't you? I inherited a house full of stuff, she said apologetically. Understanding came into his gaze, and he nodded. Forgot about that. Nan always was a bit of a collector, wasn't she? Then he rang up the sales and said, You could continue to look around. I could, she said, but you know what? I'm not getting any answers yet. She tried to put steel into her voice. If he wanted her to buy something, he also needed to answer her questions. Not that she wouldn't have bought things, but still. He stared at her glumly and said, Manny was always welcome in my house. When Manny was Meredith, she was also welcome in my house too. I thought for a while she and my son would get married. Maybe it's a good thing they didn't. But then again, maybe she wouldn't have gone on to become Manny. I'm sure it was a very troubling time for him, Doreen said gently. I certainly don't judge him for that. He nodded, obviously happy with her response. Manny was a good person. But once Manny and Peter were hooked on drugs, you could just see complete personality changes. They would go from stupors on the couch to being raving angry, and crying out with the need for the next fix. He sighed. And then they'd jump up and head out, looking to get their drugs. I know perfectly well how they got their money for that. I tried so hard to get Peter clean. I did send him to rehab, but I just didn't have any money to keep doing that. Because as soon as he got out of rehab, he headed back into trouble again. Doreen nodded. Understood, and I get that. I mean, thankfully, it's not something I've ever had to face personally. But I get that the struggle itself is something most can't fight. Do you know what happened to Manny? He shrugged. I didn't hear nothing until about a week later. I hadn't seen Manny in months at that point. So, you didn't know anything about his life? Who he had for friends or if he got engaged or anything like that? At her comment about getting engaged, he laughed. Absolutely not, he said. That wasn't something she ever planned on doing. Maybe not planned on, Doreen said, but having been married once, maybe he wanted the security of a second marriage. What security? He looked at her in astonishment. She ended up divorced. How does marriage ever offer security? These days, divorce happens most of the time, and that just ends up causing nothing but financial ruin for anybody involved. Is that what happened to her? He nodded. Her husband ended up with almost everything. And the kid half-time. She ended up with nothing, moved into a small apartment, and I think it was all over the gender identity issue. If that's the politically correct term. I'm not sure, Doreen said, but that works for me. And it would have been tough if he hadn't gotten anything out of the marriage. Did he have a job? Manny worked as a receptionist back then, Jeremiah said. For one of the doctor's offices. I think a cosmetic surgeon. Manny used to talk about how much money the doctors all made, and how envious she was that they could take somebody who was pretty ugly and turn them into somebody pretty gorgeous. He shook his head. But the amount of money those surgeries cost just blew her away. I'm sure, Doreen said. So he used to work as a receptionist, then got divorced. Did he keep his job after that? Jeremiah nodded. For a little while. But then she started hitting the gay bars, and started hitting. You know. Different groups of people who weren't very good for her. And that led her to a downward spiral. He shook his head. She was close to Peter and a couple women she worked with. They were pretty intense, the four of them. He shrugged. They were all in the same industry. Is your son still in it? He shook his head. Not really. It's not like he gets much business in that line anymore. I bring him a meal every couple of days. Tiredness and fatigue were on his face now. It really sucks. I'm sorry, Doreen said. It's got to be hard when you can't help those you love. It's such a sad scenario. Where would I find him to talk to him? He hesitated. It might set him off, he warned. Goliath took that moment to stretch toward the counter with his paws clicking the top piece. Jeremiah leaned over and stared at him in astonishment. In what way? Doreen asked hurriedly. Dragging his gaze back to her, he answered, he gets very sad about her death. Does he know for sure he's dead? I don't think there's any way to know for sure. If Peter knew something, he'd tell the cops. Right, she said. That's good to know. It is, he said. He's never deliberately broken the law, until it came to the drugs. And the drugs are just that. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. She nodded and smiled. So then the question really is, do you mind if I go talk to him? Is there any reason not to talk to him, and to see what he might know that he hasn't shared with the police, because he might not have considered it important? That's possible. He does hold a certain amount of distrust for the police. Everybody in the business does. Of course, she said. They're getting busted on every street corner. Jeremiah laughed at that. True enough. Then he thought about it for a long moment before speaking. He's usually sleeping it off at the Pandozzi corner, somewhere close to the old hotel there. When I go down, I try to hook him up with a bed for a few nights at the shelter. Get him showered and cleaned up, then have him eat some food. I guess there isn't enough housing for the vulnerable people in our society, is there? There are shelters. But they tend to fill up fast. Peter's been pretty good about going to one shelter, and they often give him a night's sleep, or a bed and a shower for helping out around the place. He sweeps the place out, taking out the garbage, things like that. Doreen brightened at that. Good, she said. Maybe they let him eat some leftovers too. He laughed. They can only help so much with the homeless because once the word gets out, they have everybody wanting the same thing. Then he said in all seriousness, There is a soup kitchen, so I know he gets a meal a day. But sometimes he gets there too late, when the soup is all gone. There's only so much I can do." "Of course," she said. "Thank you." She looked at the cups and said, "Do you have anything to carry these in?" He picked up the 4 mugs, wrapped them in old newsprint, and gently put them inside the glass bowl. Then he lifted the bowl and handed it to her and said, "There. Now you have something to carry them in."